Hello there, beautiful. This is Podcasting for Spiritual Women, and I am Kim Parkinson, podcast growth coach, podcast producer. And you know what? I actually do a lot of business coaching as well. And today I am wrapping up a 4 episode series where we are trying to help you be found more organically through the podcast players when people search, right? So if you are not getting 100 downloads per episode, these are just a couple of tips and tricks that you can do. It could be, as I stated in the first episode of this series, which was episode 20, it could be that it is because of the time of year. The time could be just not quite right. Or it could be that you just need a couple of tweaks. And so we went over the podcast name in episode 20. We went over your description in episode 21. We went over your podcast episode titles in episode 22. And now, here at episode 23, we are going to talk about just a couple of other tricks that I can offer you. Okay. So, first one is your name in your podcast player. Now, a lot of times people add in their business name. And if you are more well known by your business name than your own personal branding name, then yeah, leave that there. But might I also suggest that you add in what you do, whether that is LinkedIn coach, or maybe it is, beauty expert, or maybe priestess, or maybe it's very specific and it's sent priestess, or it is Christian pastor, or maybe it is minister. Whatever the title is of you, I suggest after your name, you just put that right in. So if you look at my podcast, it says Kim Parkinson. And then I add in one of those lines. Now, I don't know what the name of the line is. I probably should have looked that up. But it is on my laptop. It is above the enter button. It is just a straight line. You can put a colon if you want, but I don't. Whatever you want to put in. And then I put in podcast growth coach, because if somebody's looking for podcast growth, I want them to find me. So it's just another avenue, just one more way of people to be able to find me or what I do. So that's just another little tip there, right? So cute little ding right there. Now, another way, or another thing I want to tell you about, is your show notes. Your show notes are for your listeners. And there is no podcast discoverability for your show notes in a podcast player. If you take those show notes and you move those show notes to your blog, and maybe you attach the embed of your podcast in your blog, that is going to be found through your website. It is not going to organically be found through a podcast player. It just doesn't drill down that far. So if you've been really working on getting all of those keywords and all those topics and everything in there, and I've been doing it for clients for years. Honestly, I've been doing it for years. I've been adding in little tips and things like that right inside there. But here's the thing. When we use them in their blog or on their blog, that's when they're found, not in the podcast players. So unless you are making sure that your podcast is going to your website in some way, then you know what? Just keep the podcast show notes short and sweet, because you want your listener to know what it is about. And now here's another tip. Don't add 1,000 different links. This was really popular. This was really popular in the day. Back when I first started, people would put a link to their Instagram, a link to their Facebook, a link to their Facebook community. Then they would put a link to their YouTube channel. They'd put a link to their Vine or whatever it was that they had back then. I mean, heck, maybe even a MySpace page, right? Anything and everything, wherever you were found. Maybe you were also found on so-and-so's website. And because you're affiliated with that person, they'd put that on there. So many different things. But here's the thing. When your listener, because they're listeners, when your listener is on and listening to your podcast, chances are pretty good They could be doing the dishes and don't have the ability to look at all of your different ones. Or maybe they're driving and that never shows up. Or maybe they look at all of the different links that you have put in your show notes and they say, I don't know where to start. No, thank you. Now, I have mentioned before in a coaching episode, maybe put in a link tree. But you know what? That could even be confusing to people. How many links do you have in your link tree? Maybe your link tree, when they click on it, then has another 6 different links there. Where do they go? So my suggestion here, send them to the place that you want to keep them. In my case, I want you guys to book either a growth clarity call or I want you to get on my newsletter. Or maybe that's an and or. So I only put those two. I only put newsletter and I only put on the growth clarity call. Now, it's not as confusing because you know what? If you're not ready for a growth clarity call, you click on the newsletter. You're like, yep, I'm getting into the newsletter. I want to know more. If you're like, you know what? I am going to get into the growth clarity call. Guess what? There's a little button on the little form after once you fill it out. It says, would you like to be on the newsletter? And you click the little button and then you say yes. And then you're on it anyway. So make it easy for them, right? Don't confuse them. Don't get them all like, I don't know where to click or anything like that. Just make it super easy. Don't worry about all the show notes, all the long form show notes, not needed. You don't need all of that. Save that for your blog posts. Speaking of blog posts, I think that your podcast is an excellent way to be turned into a blog post. So my suggestion here is take the information that you have and then just rearrange it just a little bit, make it like nice bullet points of different pieces that you talked about, and then maybe add more information into a blog post. Why not? Right? Make it easy. But here's the thing. You don't necessarily have to release it the same day you release the episode. Now, this is also going to depend on your followers because what I have found is that my episodes are released on, Tuesdays and Thursdays right now. And on Tuesdays, they are nice and simple, easy. They come right out, right? They go out and people are listening to them. But what I have found is that on blog posts, it takes a little bit more time for the websites to crawl it and to send it out to people. People are not really subscribing to RSS feeds in a blog post as they used to. Anybody else here? Raise of hands. Remember Blogger? There was another really popular one, but you had to pay for it. And I don't remember that. I don't remember what it was. But I definitely had a blog on Blogger. And so when I wrote something, it would be sent out to my followers, right? So it was automatically sent out. It's not quite the same anymore. It doesn't do that as much anymore. So in this particular case, if you send out the podcast blog write-up the same day that the podcast goes out, there's nothing wrong with that. In regards to newsletters, I would not put out a newsletter on the same day as your podcast and say, hey, I just want to let you know that I just released this podcast and this podcast is on blah, 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 blah. And you talk about that. Because you know what? They're going to say, great, I just found out what you were talking about and I don't need to know anymore. Thanks so much. I don't need to go listen to your podcast. And so then they're not going to go. They're not going to download it. They're not going to listen to it because you just told them everything that they needed to know in your newsletter. So make your newsletter one of two things. Make your newsletter a companion piece to the podcast, meaning make it something where they're saying to themselves, I wanted to know the answer to this question that she talked about in her newsletter. And she said she had the answer to it in her podcast. I have to go listen to it. So make it something where they're going back to that particular podcast. That's kind of a neat little way to do it, right? Or you could wait and not talk about that podcast for a couple of weeks. I know it's really hard, but if you've got podcast episodes in the bank, here's the thing. This is one of the number one things people ask me about all the time is like, I put out a podcast and then what? So then now it's got a shelf life of 1 week and then nobody's listening to it anymore. Well, first of all, not true because hopefully it is evergreen content and they are going back to it or new people are finding it. And two, if you have it in some type of a what we're calling a flywheel here, right? If you have it in some type of a flywheel, you aren't actually talking about that episode for another maybe 6 weeks after it's out. Let me tell you, if you belong to my newsletter list, which you should, by the way, that's kpcreativemedia.com/news, and you can join there. If you joined my newsletter list, what I'm talking about this week in the newsletter is something that I actually recorded back in, oh my gosh, by this time, maybe still July, right? Because I was doing 2 a week. So I've got a lot of content to cover. But put it this way, because I have a lot of content to cover in like November, I'm still going to be talking about like September's episodes. So quite a lengthy difference. And the beautiful part is if people want to know more about it, then they go back to the episode, the old episode to find out more. And then they're like, you know what? I want to know about what's going on now. I want this episode now. So definitely talk about that months or weeks later. If you do not have any episodes under your belt yet, then I would keep it very vague for the very first little bit as you're getting the newsletter going and as you're getting the podcast going. Talk about the excitement of the podcast, talk about behind the scenes of the podcast, talk about how you came up with your topics of your podcast, something like that to get people to listen. And then once you've got a couple of maybe a month's worth, 2 months worth of episodes under your belt, then you're going to start the flywheel up and you talk about episode 1 and you really dive into all of the beautiful things that you talked about there. Maybe create lists. People love lists. Those are really easy to convert into social media posts if you need to. Or maybe you're going to pull out a quote. People also love quotes because, you've said it. Somebody said it. Maybe you had a guest on and that guest said it. So definitely pull out some quotes out of that. And here's the other thing. You can do almost all of this with the help of some type of AI. If you are editing in Descript, all you'd have to do is click on the AI Underlord version there, and it will spit out some stuff for you. Or if you don't, you can use something, some other platform. You could even just take your transcript and put it into chat, whatever you want to do, and just ask it. Pull out quotes about this episode or pull out a list about this episode, or maybe even tell me because if it was a couple weeks ago, you might be like, I remember. So tell it, can you pull out stuff that I talked about in this so I can write a newsletter? And then take that information and be genuine and write your newsletter with it. We have a couple of different things. We're going to change our name so that it has more discoverability there. We are not worrying about show notes. We are just limiting the number of links that we have in our show notes area. And then we're also going to do some sort of type of a newsletter flywheel type thing. Now, another thing I want you to look at in your hosting platform is they also allow you to put a website. So here's the thing. You can change that up as often as you want. And Apple Podcasts actually has that at the very bottom of your episode. So if you want, you could change that up to be the program that you're selling right now. That could be a discovery call. That could just be directly to your podcast page if you never want to change it. But you want to make sure that it works and that it is active. So when you change it, go to your own podcast and click on the links that are in there and make sure all of them work. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people or talked to people and I've clicked on the links and then I'm saying, hey, these aren't working. And it's not really, it's not a hard thing to go check, but sometimes it's just a matter of making sure that you cross your T's and dot your I's. And so that's what we're doing here. Again, lots of different other tips and tricks just to kind of make sure that your podcast has the best and most amazing growth results it can. And now, if you do all of these and in 3 to 6 months from now, this still isn't working, maybe we need to look at your content. Maybe we need to look at a couple of other pieces that you have. I don't know why the content wouldn't reach out to somebody, but you know what? I would be very interested to talk to you about it. So if you are still having trouble, please reach out, kpcreativemedia.com/growth clarity call and book that call. It's a 20-minute call and it's free. And I take a look at your podcast and you have to answer a couple questions. We take a look at the podcast and I can offer you a few tips on what's going on. And believe me, I have actually talked to women and they've gotten really great podcast cover art or they've gotten really great podcast names. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not changing it. It looks great. I absolutely love it. And so sometimes it just doesn't work out that I have anything that direction. So then we do look into your content. And maybe it's also you're not talking about your program as often as you should in your episodes. So there's a lot of other pieces to this, but no piece is necessarily standalone and no piece has to be done right away and no piece is forever. So build them as you go. All right, until next week, talk to you soon. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcasting for Spiritual Women. If you would like more strategy and tips and some tricks on how to make your podcast better, I recommend that you join my newsletter list. You can find that at kpcreativemedia.com/newsletter. Until next time.